Fantastic. Good evening, everyone. So nice to study with you again. Before we start, first of all, Hanukkah Sameach, a very happy Hanukkah. Hope everyone's enjoying, and it will dovetail quite nicely with tonight's lecture, as we shall see as we begin the third night of Hanukkah, which is also, of course, the third part of our series and also our series finale on this topic of becoming a Jewish parent, which is this exciting, exciting new part that many of us are beginning over this past year or so, and looking into Jewish tradition for a little insight on what does it mean to be a Jewish parent, how does one be a Jewish parent, and how does one raise Jewish children. And this is a topic which we could spend a huge amount of time on, and I'm sure there will be opportunities, over the next couple years where we will talk about different aspects of Jewish parenting, Jewish home life, and so on. But this at least was a good start to the topic, as we all kind of just get our feet wet in Jewish parenting. And so we've previously looked at kind of just the question about, Jewish view of becoming parents, of having children. Last week, we looked at some of the ideas around the importance of Jewish education and imparting Jewish knowledge to the next generation. Tonight, I want to focus on a bit more, not on, that we must, but in the sense of how to, right? How does one actually do this? And this is, I think, often a question that people ask, how does one be an effective Jewish parent, right? How does one ensure that their children will grow up, to remain committed to, being Jews and wanting to live an active and rich Jewish life? And so tonight I'd like to just kind of, again, give some insights, some kind of principles, as it were, that I think can be applied and can hopefully fuel some reflection on how we can actually implement some of these principles and achieve these goals. So we're going to look at a couple different things tonight in that context. But I really want to start with, I think, the principle, right? Kind of one of the core ideas that really gets to the heart of how does one effectively parent as a Jew. And I'll begin with sharing an insight into one of the episodes in the Torah. And the Torah focuses primarily, if one looks at the entire 5 books, right, we refer to it as the Chamisha Chumshei Torah, the 5 books of the Torah, right? But we call it the 5 books of Moses, right? Because really, most of the Torah deals with Moshe, obviously not Genesis, but the next 4 books obviously center around Moshe and his experiences, and then his role as the Rabban Shel Yisrael, right, the teacher of Israel. And there is an amazing, or surprising perhaps, conclusion to the leadership or to the reign of Moses, where he transfers the mantle of leadership to his student Joshua, to Yehoshua. And in of itself, that makes a lot of sense. Joshua was his student. He really was mentored by Moshe. We have many episodes in the Torah that describe the relationship and the role of Joshua. And so it makes sense that he then is the appropriate person to take over. The only reason that it's, shall we say, surprising is that in most other forms of leadership in the Torah and in the Bible, there is a transfer of authority not from a person to, shall we say, the most appropriate candidate, but usually it's their child. So we think of the Kohanim, right, to the priests. So it's transferred that their children will then become the priests after them. And you find that with the kings of Israel, right, that it was hereditary, right, that it wasn't elected, it wasn't just the best leader was chosen, but it actually was a hereditary authority. And as a result, Moshe in many ways acted as the king of Israel. In fact, according to some of the medieval rabbis, he had the status of a king. And yet it is not his children that assume the leadership, but it's Joshua. So the question is, why not? Why not? And if you look back at the story of Moshe, you actually realize that his children were absent. His children were absent from the story. If you look back at the beginning of Moshe's kind of experience, right, we know that he leaves Egypt and he goes to Midian. There he marries and he has children. And as he's returning, right after the episode with the burning bush, he's coming with his wife and with his children. And then there's this very strange story where they encounter this angel, and the angel tries to kill Moshe. His wife circumcises the children. At the end of the whole story, she takes the kids and goes back to Midian. Now, it's not the end of it. We know that eventually they do come together, but they come together later, after the Jewish people are en route back, and possibly even after Mount Sinai. So if you think about it, then essentially Moshe's children never witnessed the slavery in Egypt. They never, witnessed the miracles, the plagues. They weren't there for the Exodus. They didn't see the splitting of the sea. They didn't hear God's voice at Mount Sinai. And so essentially all of the experiences, right, these formative experiences of the Jewish nation, Moshe's children were absent. They missed out. And so ultimately, how could they possibly lead the people when they hadn't experienced all these things that everyone had gone through? And so it seems that they just simply weren't appropriate. Now, as Levites, we know that they carry on with certain roles within the temple. But in terms of their, to be Moshe, that they are not, because they did not experience everything that the Jewish people had experienced. And I think this really kind of gets to, the nub of it, right? If we were really kind of like zero in from the very beginning of tonight's class, that the key, right, to Jewish continuity, right, which is like very popular and people spend a lot of time thinking about Jewish continuity nowadays, is the idea of the lived experience, right? It's the fact that you have experienced something for yourself, that ultimately, right, empowers you or sits within you and impacts the way that you then live your life. And I have found that when I've spoken to couples, right, who I marry, who I get to know, and I ask them, like, why is this important to you? So they say, oh, I remember, my grandmother lighting the Shabbat candles, we did Friday night dinners. And I say, that's great, right? That's great. You have those memories, you have those experiences. But what you have to remember, right, you have to realize is your children don't have any of that. Right? They don't have any of that. And unless you ensure that they have those experiences, then they will not have their identity formed by those experiences the way that you have. And the fact that you've had those experiences are ultimately meaningless in terms of your child's own, identity formation, right? And so it's very nice. You can tell them stories about it. You can tell them that, oh, you remember your grandmother lighting the candles, or you're going to your family for Friday night dinner. But if they don't remember watching you light candles, or your Friday night dinner, or going with you to synagogue, or traveling to Israel, or watching you put on your tefillin or whatever the case may be, then ultimately those won't be their own lived experiences. And so I think first and foremost, right, the key to Jewish education is making sure that your children have those formative experiences, which is why I say Hanukkah is a great time, because obviously for those of you that saw the picture that I sent out, with Andrea and Dove and myself, he's staring at the candles in the picture. And it's those experiences that ultimately kids will grow up around. Those will be their memories. Those are the things that will become second nature. And then they will then do it as adults as well. And I think if we would kind of look back at our own lives, I actually think it's really interesting to think about, like, what were those experiences that like really sit with you, that like made an impression on your memory about kind of like your Jewish identity. And I grew up in a religious Jewish home, whose life was really kind of centered around the Jewish calendar and Shabbat. And so I have lots of incredible memories, of going to synagogue and as this little kid talking to the old people in shul and things that they would say, and we would think that's funny, we would laugh about it, but like these like really wonderful kind of intergenerational experiences. I have really strong memories of Pesach with my grandparents, where they would come to visit and we would have the Seder, and the jokes that would be told every single year, or just kind of the being around each other and really feeling that connection. And that's powerful, because then that becomes part of your identity, and therefore is like a reminder about to say, okay, if those are things that were important to me, that I look back and I really remember, then like that's a good key to say, like, okay, so you have to like prioritize that to make sure your children get some kind of similar memory as well. So I think this is here where I want to just like pause us for a second and actually ask, for anybody kind of here to add, what are the memories that you have as a child that you've kind of like carried with you? Because I think we can all kind of learn from that, and think about, like, it helps us all think about maybe experiences we had that have kind of stayed with us and make us, connected to being Jewish, that perhaps could be that way for our children too. So if anybody wants to unmute themselves, turn on their video and share, I would love to, I'd love to hear. Hey, Alex.
Hi. Yeah, apologies if this comes out quite bad. We've got some tech issues. So things, certainly for me, as you say, the Seder is a really powerful memory. It was, an opportunity for all the family to be together, as well as to do all the things that you do at Seder. The continued arguments about who had the correct Haggadah, because there was always somebody with a slightly off tradition or rubric. But I think
Alex, would you mind just shutting the video? Alex, would you mind just shutting your video? That way we'll hear your sound a little bit more clearly.
Yeah, that's that might help. Yeah, so I think the Seder is a really important thing, but just the general cycle of the calendar was drummed in. I mean, one thing that when I was learning how to read Hebrew that my mother did that was really, really powerful was to get me to read each day of the week the sort of corresponding number of the parashah. So Sunday was Kohen, Monday was Levi, and all the way through to Shabbat morning when you read the seventh portion before going to synagogue, and then reading the translation of each one of those, you got through, for a couple of years, I read through the entire Chamisha Torah all the way through, whilst like learning to read Hebrew, and we were doing sort of translation at school as well. But that was a really interesting way of kind of tying everything into the calendar and what was going on, and a way of, I guess, keeping my attention whilst I was in shul as well. But those sorts of things, like just little things to, little things that looking back were sort of really about just reminding me that we were Jewish, and doing lots of stuff because, school was a Jewish school, but it wasn't particularly religious environment. So yeah, it was lots of little things like that. And I think I like your point about the lived experience, making sure that, we do things, for example, this evening we lit the Hanukkah candles. George had been having a pretty rough afternoon, but watching us light the Hanukkah candles, he calmed down and watched and took it all in. And so, there's a kind of powerful message there of the strength of practice.
Yeah, absolutely. That's beautiful, Alex. Thanks for sharing that. Then we'll get to some of those ideas, and let's think a little bit more about that. Does anyone else want to share any memories that kind of have stuck with them? Okay, we're all being a little. Oh, yeah, great.
I'm gonna try to share, but baby is not having it right now. Most of my stuff was cultural, like holidays and festivals, of course, but things like food. And my grandma used to send us tapes of Sesame Street Israel, which I think I've always always remembered watching those.
What about them made you like remember them so much? Was it like getting it from your grandma, or?
Yeah, just like this idea that there was this place that was completely Jewish and we had our own language, and it was, I didn't have so much exposure to that sort of stuff growing up in America, and I remember it.
Yeah, that's
okay.
Nice, right.
On mute now.
That's okay. No, I think that's really interesting, right? So that idea of that it's like a whole world, and obviously people in Israel like have that sense, and maybe if one lives in like a very Jewish area, you can have that sense, but otherwise, it's kind of a thing you kind of dip in and out of almost. So I think, whether it's like Andrew was saying, kind of being exposed to the fact that there are places where it is like a whole world, or Alex, the way that your mom kind of made every day of the week was something, that tied it in. I think that's like a really powerful kind of like messaging about like that this is like a whole world. This is like an entire culture. This is an entire, life, and it's not just this kind of like pocketed type of hobby, maybe I would say. So that's really good. I think there's probably a lot more. We could all think about it in the days ahead, weeks ahead, years ahead, about what are the memories that really touched us, and how do they impact us. I think there's another component, and this is where I kind of want to like go a step further, right? So there's certainly this idea of like the lived experience, and so thinking, what will my child's memories look like, and making sure that they have those memories, those experiences. But I think if I dip out, I'm coming back, so apologies. So there's then going a bit further, which goes into, I think, kind of like going a little bit beyond, or below the surface, and really thinking about it a bit more intensely than even that. And that relates to something that we said last week. So last week we spent a lot of time studying the first paragraph of the Shema, and we looked at each sentence and kind of what it tells us. And we shared an insight from the late Chief Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks, where he pointed out that obviously the middle, one of the middle verses in that paragraph is the source of Jewish education, V'shinantam levanecha, that you shall teach your child. And he says the key to that is how you do that effectively is in the first sentence, which is v'ahavta, and you shall love. And the love of God, the love of following God's way. And he said that if one wants to effectively teach their children, then they need to love it themselves. And that's That's really true. That's really true. Meaning, if as parents, we do something to go through the motions, things we don't really like, we don't really care about, there's a pretty good chance that that will be our children's relationship to those things too. So like, if you hate, throwing out the garbage, your kids will probably grow up thinking like taking out the garbage is like this awful thing to do. I mean, it's just a silly example, but like, but if you're like, no, it's good, we got to clean the house. If you like cleaning the house, your children will grow up liking to clean the house. If you hate cleaning the house, your children probably will hate cleaning the house too. All the more so, more important areas in terms of like our religious lives. If it's something that you love, your children will love it as well, right? Because they will see that you love it and they will learn to love it too, right? The things that you find precious, the things that you really value, your children will come to value as well. Assuming they, again, have the experiences of it personally too. So I think as parents, that becomes really important, right? Because there's like this moment where we have to kind of check ourselves and to say, at a certain point, are we just going through the motions, right? Are we just kind of like, this is what we do? Or are we kind of really tuned in to how much to loving it ourselves? So if we keep Shabbat, if we have Shabbat dinner, if we, say our prayers, but kind of do it in a perfunctory kind of way, in a kind of just, it's what I'm just doing it, I don't really like it, right? Then chances are your kids won't value it either. But if your kids see that you're excited about it, they see that you open up Jewish books at home and you study Torah and you go to synagogue and you volunteer and you contribute and you're excited about it and you love doing it, then they're going to be excited. They're going to be into it as well. I mean, that's the way kids are, right? They get excited about the things that their parents are excited about too. So I think that's where their point goes further of like, we need to really think about like, you need to make sure that you love doing the things that you do. Or if there's things that you want your kids to have, you got to maybe give a bit more energy into those things so that that's their experience of them, because they will take the cues from you. And so if you're kind of like, meh, it's not going to work. They have to see that it's something that you are passionate about, that you love, that you think is important. And then they will feel the same way about those things too. There is a story that I heard from a rabbi, which I think is like a great story. He has a few stories that I really like that I want to share. And I think they kind of capture some of these messages. So the first one ties a bit directly to this. He tells a story that he had this is in America, and he had a young family over for Shabbat, not a religious Jewish family, but they met the rabbi and he invited them for Shabbat dinner, so they came and they had a nice time. They enjoyed it, and they're asking about them, how they met and so on. And so they were telling the story to the rabbi that when they the story is from a Rabbi Brander who now lives in Israel. So he said that they told him that when they first met and they were, dating and, thinking about getting more serious. So that they were invited over to the other person for, to meet the family. And so they went to meet the girl's parents and to have dinner. And she said that, she kind of was like setting up, and he said, is there anything I should be worried about? And she told him, she goes, no, my parents are super nice, really easygoing. They're going to love you. She says, the only pet peeve that my father has is he really hates talking gossip, to the extent that like if people start like talking about other people, he really will excuse himself from the table and walk away. So whatever you do, don't start gossiping. Okay, nice story. The rabbi says 6 months later, he had them over for dinner again. And he's talking to them, getting to know them, and the girl mentioned that she comes from, her background, obviously, many generations before was from religious family. And she said that actually her family had been rabbis. So he said, oh, what was the name of the family? So she said, oh, his name was Rabbi Kagan, Rabbi Yisrael Meir Kagan. And the rabbi's like, that's a really famous rabbi, right? That rabbi is known as the Chafetz Chaim, who lived very, late 19th, early 20th century in Galicia, in southern Poland, in the town of Radin. And Chofetz Chaim wrote a number of important works. But one of the things he was most known for was his aversion to Lashon Hara, was his aversion to gossip. And there's all these stories about how he would have a little note in front of him reminding him always when people would come to talk to him not to speak gossip. He wrote a whole book on the laws of Lashon Hara that he's known by, the Chofetz Chaim. And amazingly, right, several generations later, right, this one descendant of his, not religious at all, but doesn't speak Lashon Hara, right, will not gossip. And he gave this as an example that, like, if there is something that, like, you are committed to, that you are passionate about, that, like, really is, like, so important to you, that thing will last. That thing will get passed down, beyond. And so he tells people, and I think this is a great idea, is like, as families, we need to think about, like, what are the things that, like, we really care about, right? What are the things that are really important to us? And those things will leave an imprint, right? Those things will get passed on. Our children will not be exactly the way that we are, right? That's just the nature of things. Ultimately, they will make some of their own decisions. But if there is something that is really important to you, there's a really good chance that will ultimately be really important to your child too. So if you think that going to synagogue is, like, super important, and it's something you do even when it's inconvenient, even when you're on holiday, you search out the shul and you go there and all these kinds of things, then your kids will, for them, going to shul will just be part of who they are and will be something they will choose to do, when they're adults as well. And take that for anything, that's just one example. But I think that idea is really important, that, again, if there's something that you really love, your children will come to love that because they will see that on your face. And so that's what I mean, that there's this important moment to kind of sit and reflect on what are the things that are really important to you, and are you kind of demonstrating that love of them so that your children can see that, and then they will imbibe that as well as they share in those experiences with you. So I think that's like a really important frame for this. Kind of on the flip side is another story that Rabbi Brander shared that I think kind of, like, illustrates kind of the pitfalls as well. So this is a story he tells families. He says to them, he goes, he was a rabbi in Florida. So a lot of people on their winter breaks and things like that would go to Disney World in Orlando. And he said, like, he says, you're going to be standing in line at Disney World, and you're going to, like, go up to the ticket counter, and he says you're going to have, like, a moment there where he's like, I want you to think about the following question. So here he's talking to America. Right, so he's talking about in America where Jewish education is private pay, different than it is in the UK. And he tells them, he's like, let's start calculating.
We didn't hear any of that story, Shalom. That whole
story.
You hear me now? We hear you, but we didn't hear any of it. That's
okay. I got it. So fine. So I'll start over then, just to make sure. So he's telling the family, to his synagogue. He says, a lot of you are about to go on your winter breaks, and he's a rabbi in Florida. He says you're going to go to Disney World in Orlando. And he says, you're going to be waiting in line at the, at the ticket booth. And he says, he goes, before you approach the teller, I want you to think to yourself the following thing. He says, what I want you to think to yourself is, you send your kids to Jewish school. And in America, Jewish school is private pay, which means it's expensive. It's expensive. And so parents have to be really committed to make that choice. And he says, you send your kids to primary school. And he said, think of that, let's say that's 8 years. And I'll just throw out numbers. Let's say that's, I don't know, $10,000 a year. So $80,000 for that. And then he says, and then you send your kids to 4 years of Jewish high school, which is another 4 years. And that school is maybe $20,000 a year. So you're up to about $160,000. He says, you're going to get up to the teller and you're going to have a very short 14-year-old who hasn't yet grown, and they're going to ask you, how many children, how many adults, and they're apparently the break office age of around 13. So he says you're going to be very tempted to say, child, because the ticket's like half price. He says, for the $30 that you're going to save by saying that your kid is a child, you are going to lose $160,000 that you've just spent on their education. Because, when your children see that at the end of the day, right, you do not actually live the values that like you have just invested in teaching them, right? They will see the inconsistency, and it will almost have been if you didn't bother giving them that education, because they will see you as a fraud. It's a powerful story. It's maybe a little bit extreme, but that idea about that, like, your children watch you, they look at you, they will see the things that you really care about, and they will see what you really care about by the choices you make when it can be difficult to actually implement those things, right? And so for me, I remember going to shul with my father, literally rain, sleet, or snow. Now, we lived a mile from the synagogue. We walked, and I grew up in a town where it snowed a lot. So we could sometimes walk to synagogue in like 1.5 feet of snow. And unless it was like literally like dangerous outside, we went anyway. We would go, and there was always this feeling when we got there of like, it would be quiet because not some people would make the trek. And it was like this feeling of like, we are committed, we are doing this. This is like our life. And it was powerful. It was really beautiful. And so I think that idea of like really showing our children consistency, that like we practice what we preach, living the truth of it. I think that has a huge impact on children, because ultimately children really will watch us, right? They'll take the cues from us. And so as parents, maybe it is a little bit of acting, but like we need to think about, that they're watching us, and they don't necessarily have the nuance that we have as adults. And so as an adult, making a particular decision might be completely reasonable, but like a child could potentially perceive that as being inconsistent. And obviously you can explain that to a child and teach them nuance, but to be sensitive about that, I think, is something really useful, because, to be self-conscious. Hi, everyone. I'm really sorry about that. To be a bit self-conscious about like our own kind of Jewish lives, our moral lives, our, anything that's important to us is something that our children will see, and it will absolutely, rub off on them. And so there's sometimes when things are difficult, those are the best opportunities to leave an impression on your kids. So it's actually almost like look for those times that you can like kind of demonstrate that will, I think, have a real impact on your kids, and, and the things that are important to you that will then come across to them. And again, obviously, as they get older, you can talk about nuance, but as little kids, I think it's really important that they kind of experience that, and they'll feel that connection. Now, the thing that I want to just kind of like mention, because I've definitely had this conversation with lots of people, is I think often the issue of like around religious coercion. We saw in the Shema, right, that there's a mitzvah to educate our children. And according to the halakha, obviously a person becomes obligated personally to keep the laws when they become b'nei mitzvah, right, bar bat mitzvah. Girls at 12, boys at 13. And that's when their personal responsibility, in a sense, kicks in. But the notion of education begins earlier, and there's the idea of chinuch and of education, and there's this idea of like the age of chinuch. And so here you have this idea within the tradition that you don't wait till your kid is bar bat mitzvah for them to start doing the mitzvot, but you actually kind of educate them to do those things before they reach those ages. And for different things, they might begin at different times, right? Like you're not necessarily going to have your kid fast, right? You shouldn't when they're 6 years old, but maybe when they're, 11 or 12, they could, maybe skip breakfast, just start with lunch that day, right? Kind of like maybe if they're the next year they're going to be bar mitzvah, maybe that year they do fast, right? You kind of like slowly kind of build it up. But other things, you basically, as they can become self-aware about those things, that's when they get implemented, right? So you think of like the laws of Shabbat, those things would be earlier, as long as the kids understand, we do this, we don't do that, then they should know we don't do that. It's Shabbat. That's not the thing, that we do. So they, when they're obviously 2 years old, they don't have that comprehension. It's not so much an issue. But once they're 4, 5, 6 years old, they're aware of these. Okay, it's Shabbat. We don't turn on the television or whatever the case may be. And so in general, we're thinking about helping our children grow into these things. I would say the one thing that we try to do with children, even before they understand, is kosher, where there's this idea that the food you put into your body somehow impacts you, right, on like a religious kind of spiritual level. So kashrut we try to do with kids, right, that they should only eat kosher food, even though they're little, they don't understand yet. There are questions about waiting between milk and meat and things like that, with obviously little kids, you don't have to stop them from having milk. They need their milk, right? But certainly not in terms of eating it together and things like that. So to kind of ideally, so, there's kind of stages for those things. So again, it's about thinking about the appropriate ages to do those things. But I've definitely met families who didn't grow up religious, became observant as adults, maybe not fully observant, somewhat observant. And it was something that they chose to do, right? Something they had choice over. Now, obviously with your children, they're going to do what you tell them. Okay. Say that again. Obviously with children, they're not going to have choice, right? They're going to do whatever you tell them to do. And so sometimes parents feel uncomfortable with that. Am I like imposing this life, on my kids? And I think the answer is yes and no. Meaning, if this is something that's important to you, then teach it to your children. Let them see the beauty in it. Let them come to appreciate and understand it in a way that you have come to love and appreciate it and understand it. And ultimately, it's not coercion. When they become adults, if they want to make different choices, they'll make different choices. But in essence, you're giving them a leg up, right? Because they'll have had those experiences, right? They'll have had those memories so while you maybe as an adult had to choose this and discover these things, they will already have it inside of them. So you're giving them that gift that it will be kind of like part of who they are. They won't have to struggle with it in the way that maybe you had to struggle, with it to learn these things. They'll always have had it. And so I always tell parents, listen, it's something that's important to you. So teach it to your children. Let them learn to love it. We're doing religious coercion. When they're adults, they can choose other things. That's okay. We all make different, our own choices as adults, but you're just giving them the opportunity to have that rich exposure as kids and for them to learn to appreciate it. So, I think whenever that kind of feeling reaches in, just kind of put that to the side. It's okay. Hopefully make it something beautiful for your children. It won't feel like coercion. Sorry, it's really bad tonight. They won't ultimately feel like it's coercion in that sense. It'll be their life. It'll be okay. I think the final point I want to make, and then see if people have questions, is, we always been talking about the role of like parents to children. But I think the flip side of this, and this is something that's important, is that obviously the Torah also has the idea of children to their parents, the idea of kibud av va'em, right, of respecting one's parents. And that's like a really important mitzvah, because if children respect their parents, then it means that like children are like open to what their parents say to them, right? If you have to respect, if you have to listen to what your parents say, then ultimately that translates into them then accepting the instruction that you give to them. And so that notion of like not insisting in a like heavy-handed way at all, but that like children need to respect their parents. It's a mitzvah, it's kibud av va'em. It's like a really important value to have. And obviously children just hope naturally want to do what their parents want, naturally want to make their parents proud. But I think to just like think about like making sure that that is part of it, that like you're not just your kid's pal. You're not just their buddy. Hopefully you are as too, but you're their parents, and there need to be kind of those recognition, obviously, of that hierarchy and that boundary. And that through that, your children will come to kind of hopefully look up to you and respect you, in addition to loving you, and be in kind of in a position to really hopefully learn from you and to take in the things that you share with them and that you show them in life. So there's a whole other conversation about honoring parents, but I just wanted to kind of mention, because I think that dynamic is important to successfully educate your children, is that that dynamic has to be there from their perspective too. But really to end, sorry everyone, but really the end of it, I think the key point is that part that we start with Rabbi Sachs, is what you love, they will love. Just love it. Think about what their memories will look like. Make sure that they have the opportunity to have those memories. And ultimately, this will be something that they will love to do. They'll be proud to do. It'll be part of their lives. And will be something that they will then, please God, pass on to their children too. I think that's kind of where I want to wrap up. It's a good thing we're finishing now because the internet's awful. But I think that's where I want to wrap up, because I think that kind of gets to the heart of it, and is a good way for just things for us to think about. Again, think about your memories, think about what's important to you, and give that to your children, and they will ultimately have a wonderful experience. But I am curious, before we end, if anyone has any comments or thoughts or questions, I'd love to hear what anybody else might have to say. If there's anything else that you'd like addressed in a future class, whatever the case may be, feel free to unmute or open your video. Okay, then I will wish everyone a good evening and once again, a very happy Hanukkah. It's been wonderful studying with you and with those of you who are watching the videos after. And yeah, I look forward to seeing you around, seeing your kids, seeing them grow up in Bevis Marks, which is a really special place for that to be their memories of being Jewish. And yeah, I hope this is just the beginning of a new journey in each of our families' lives, in our personal lives, and in our community's life. And we're going to build something really special and memorable for all of us. So thank you all so much for participating in these classes, and hope to see you soon. Have a good night.
Thank you, Rabbi.